Thank you. My goodness, what an introduction. I'm reminded of this fading, yellowing cartoon from the New Yorker that I've had on my refrigerator for more than 20 years that shows two men standing in hell, the flames licking up around them, and one guy says to the other, "Apparently my over 200 screen credits didn't mean a damn thing." I'm also reminded of this event that happened very early on after the baseball series was aired. You know, someone told me that a real sign of immortality was if you were the subject of an editorial cartoon somewhere in America. And after the Civil War series, indeed, 3 or 4 newspapers printed funny editorial cartoons about the series and Dan Quayle and his attention span and things like that. But after baseball, there were literally dozens. And one day after my daughters got off the school bus, I ran up to them and showed them a cartoon that had been sent in that day that showed 2 kids ogling a just signed baseball. And this very heroic figure with a Beatles haircut was sort of heading off into the sunset. And the bubble over the kid says, "Ooh, Ken Burns." And I was just like, and my oldest daughter, Sarah, said, "Yeah, Daddy, but look what somebody brought into school." And it showed a bleary-eyed couple sitting on a couch with the TV blaring, and the bubble over the TV said, "Coming soon to PBS, OJ, a 2,750-hour documentary." And one of the bleary-eyed couple, the bubble over them says, "Ken Burns has to be stopped." And this is from my own daughters, mind you. First of all, I want to say how happy I am to be here this evening. It's a real honor and privilege. I also want to say how honored I am to be introduced by Annette. Sometime in May, Annette and her wonderful husband Mark and their dear friends and her mother Cecile showed up at the Museum of Television and Radio, where we began to talk about jazz to the public for the first time. I've basically been on the road ever since, and tonight is the last official kind of American promotional or discussion effort for a while, and tomorrow I get to go home. And it's so nice that my experience of traveling around the country, of sharing jazz with audiences in rural areas and city areas, north and south, east and west, black and white, young and old, male and female, should be bracketed by the commentary and generosity of Annette Insdorf, who is my hero. So there's a little bit of log rolling going on here, my dear. This is a film that is, as Annette said, 10 episodes and 17 and a half hours. And I had been planning tonight to show a couple of chapters. Each episode has about 10 chapters, 150 chapters in the whole thing, and I was going to show 10, and then suddenly I said, this is completely unfair to all of you, so I've asked the ushers to shut the door, and we will be done at about 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. And we'll take some breaks between the episodes, but we'll be able to get through it together. No, just a couple of chapters. Let me just tell you a little bit about this. I see this film as the completion of a trilogy. I wish that I could tell you that this was a trilogy that I had planned out and had been working on since 1984 when I began the Civil War series. It's not, but let me just tell you a little bit about how I got here, and maybe that will provide enough context for the clips and for our discussion afterwards, which I'm really looking forward to most of all. In 1984, I began work on a history of the Civil War. I did so because the Civil War seemed to be the defining topic that influenced all of the films I had worked on so far. The Brooklyn Bridge, the subject of my first film, would not have been built without this new metal called steel, which the Civil War helped to promote. The man who built the Brooklyn Bridge, Washington Roebling, got his practical training as a bridge builder during the Civil War. The second film on the Shakers, about that religious sect, they declined precipitously after the war, not just because of the social and economic changes that took place in America, but the psychic changes that took place in a country that had just murdered 630,000 of its own people. The third film was on the Statue of Liberty. The statue was originally intended as a gift from the French to Mrs. Lincoln to commemorate the survival of the Union despite her husband's ultimate sacrifice, and it only later developed into the symbol of immigration that we believe it to be now. The next film I made was on Huey Long. Huey was from a dirt-poor North Louisiana parish that thought the Confederacy was a rich man's cause and threatened to secede from the Confederacy and rejoin the Union, and so became a kind of hotbed of radicalism and socialism and populism that eventually spawned this swamp thing we know as Huey Long. And finally, the fifth film I worked on was a history of the Congress, and the Congress's greatest test was when the Civil War took place, when there were two Congresses, one in Washington, D.C., and another in Montgomery, Alabama, later Richmond, Virginia. So I was literally compelled to try to understand what Shelby Foote said in that series was the defining moment of our nation, the crossroads of our being, he said. As I was working on the Civil War, I knew, as I haven't really known in a lot of instances, what I was going to do next. Even before I started the Civil War, I knew I'd do something small on the history of baseball. It seemed completely unrelated to Civil War as I began it. But as I got involved in the film, I realized how much the story of baseball belied the sense that most Americans have that our history is essentially a political, military narrative, that wars and generals and presidents are all we need to understand who we are. It is not enough. And so I found in the story of baseball that I was essentially making a sequel to the Civil War and hadn't really realized this. Baseball considered the question of race that the Civil War had been fought over. It was about immigration and assimilation and the sense of participation in a national pastime that meant so much more in terms of a badge of citizenship than any piece of paper from the State Department. This is a film about the ever-present tension between labor and management, about the exclusion of women, about the growth and decay of great cities, about the nature of popular culture and advertising, the nature of heroes and villains and fools. All these wonderful themes sort of got caught up in the wake of baseball. It's almost as if William Blake, the poet, had said you could find an American universe in this grain of baseball sand. And so we pursued that for many years. And as we did, we began to see that the central pivotal episodes, or innings as our conceit was for that series, of the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and 50s, were brought alive by a music that I didn't know too much about, jazz. I was born in 1953. My music was R&B and rock and roll and soul. My father played jazz music when I was growing up a little bit on the phonograph. I worked in a record store for 4 years during high school and got to know all the music, but it wasn't my music. But more and more as a filmmaker, I began using this music as the soundtrack to bring alive various film subjects that I'd done, whether it was radio, whether it was Huey Long, even the Brooklyn Bridge film enjoyed an early piece of jazz. And I was getting more and more curious about it. Just after the Civil War was finished and when I was in the middle of working on baseball, I gave a talk about black soldiers that I was passionate about at the Metropolitan Museum, and in the front row was Wynton Marsalis. And after that was done, he came up to me and we kind of had a meeting of the minds, and he said, you know, you should do something on jazz. And I said, yeah, and I sort of walked away. No one likes to be told what their next film should be. And then later on, we had the great good fortune working on jazz to do an interview with a man named Gerald Early, who is the director of African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, and a really great essayist and writer. And he said this wonderful thing. He said that when they study our American civilization 2,000 years from now, Americans will be known for only three things: the Constitution, baseball, and jazz music. They're the three most beautiful things Americans have ever produced, he said. And that really got me thinking about what to do. And I realized that what Gerald Early was saying, and what compelled me to make this series, to spend the last 6 years working on this story, is that I think he was saying by that choice, and I believe he was absolutely right, that the genius of America is improvisation. The Constitution is 4 pieces of paper written at the end of the 18th century, just 4 pieces of paper, that's able to adjudicate our most complicated problems in this, a new 21st century, except for Florida. baseball is a simple children's stick and ball game. Nearly every culture has one, and yet in ours, it sort of transformed itself, metamorphosized into this no drama of intense complexity and symbolic meaning with infinite chess-like combinations. And of course, at the heart of the only art form that Americans have created is this idea that I do not have to play the notes that are on the page. I can play who I am, what I feel in this moment, and actually the transfer of that information is the art created in the spot, and this will commend us down through the centuries to the latest generation as Abraham Lincoln, and we will be remembered for this extraordinary music. And so as I worked on the series for the 6 years, I began to see how much jazz was not just about the music and the amazing human beings who made it, but a kind of window onto the soul of the country, not just where we'd been, but where we might be going, a kind of sense of our redemptive future possibilities as a republic. I began to see that jazz was a mirror that reflected back at us where we'd been over the last century, this turbulent 20th century, in good and bad ways, that it was a prism through which we could see refracted so much more than this glorious music and the amazing human beings who made it. Human beings, by the way, who I think should be ranked in the pantheon of American figures in the same way we rank our generals and our politicians of the Civil War or the baseball heroes. And so we worked on a film that was trying to gather all of that in. And so this film is not just about music. It is about 2 world wars and a devastating depression and the soundtrack that got Americans through the most difficult of times. This is a film, ladies and gentlemen, about sex, the way men and women talk to one another through music, through art, a kind of complicated and elegant and sophisticated ritual of courtship, a mating call that has been practically abandoned in the popular music of today. This is a film about drug abuse and the terrible cost of addiction. This is a film, again, about great cities, their growth, their decay, and I'm very pleased to say their rebirth. And this, of course, is a film about race, about slavery and civil war, about minstrelsy and emancipation, about Reconstruction and Jim Crow, about lynchings and progress forward and progress backwards and civil rights. How ironic that the only art form that Americans will be credited with creating was born for the most part in a community that has the historical memory of being unfree in a supposedly free land. When Thomas Jefferson wrote the sterling words of our creed that all men are created equal, he owned 200 human beings and never saw fit in his lifetime to free them, and so set in motion this fault line of race that has obviously bedeviled us, but also ennobled our American process. And it's very clear to point out where the tragedy has come from. The Civil War would not have taken place, where the frustration and the impatience arises. When you look at baseball and contemplate that it took till April 15th, 1947 for the first African American to play in our so-called national pastime. And yet, it manifests itself so gloriously, as Albert Murray says, a kind of affirmation in the face of adversity in this music, which is our gift to posterity, our art form. You know, make no mistake, this is not black music, this is not African music, this is American music, born in an African-American community for the most part, but then shared gloriously with the rest of the country and the rest of the world. How could it not be so? It is an art form and needs to be carried on the communication between individuals at any given moment. And so our film developed into much more than we realized it would be. And I thought I would share with you a couple of chapters which have not yet, from episodes that have not yet been broadcast, and introduce them. But first, I'm compelled to tell you that when you see, and perhaps like, a Ken Burns film, I'm really merely the front man for a huge number of people who make it possible. And not too dissimilar to a conductor, but I don't think I'll take that much credit either. And this film could not have been made without the talents of great writers like Jeffrey Ward and producers and editors. And this evening, I'm very pleased to say that 2 people who worked on the film are in the audience. One is the associate producer, Sarah Botstein, and the other is my longtime producing partner who's been with me since the Civil War and through baseball, and Frank Lloyd Wright, a great filmmaker filmmaker in her own right, Lynn Novick. Lynn, where are you? Will you just stand up? She's just back here. Okay, I've talked too long. Let's get started. I'm going to show you two clips. One is from our episode 7, which are the years 1939, 1940 to 1945. It's an episode called Dedicated to Chaos. It's about the war years. And we're now at this stage in the broadcast on WNET up to sort of the middle of swing. This sort of carries on a little bit and really doesn't need too much of an introduction. The second clip is from our 8th episode called Risk. By the way, the 7th will be shown next Tuesday, and the 8th will be shown on next Wednesday. And the 6th episode, which we're heading into, a big mammoth section on the height of swing, which we started last night. And boy, you're gluttons for punishment for showing up here when it's not even on. I hope you have a chance to continue the story and follow the threads of this rather complicated double helix of a story following all these wonderful people like Ellington and Armstrong. The second clip is from our 8th episode. It's about Risk. It's mostly about Bebop and Charlie Parker, but I thought I'd stop and show you a short section on one of his disciples, a man named Miles Davis. And it's the first of several chapters on Miles Davis that will occupy and in some ways command the attention of the last several episodes. And I only have one caveat, is that Gerald Early, the man I mentioned who sort of set this all in motion, appears in this chapter, but he is not identified because he was just identified in the previous chapter. Remember, you're just seeing one chapter out of 15 in an episode, and it refers to a trip to Paris that Charlie Parker made with Sidney Bechet. Charlie Parker was a heroin addict from the age of 17 and had now revolutionized jazz with this new revolution called bebop that completely rearranged the molecules of the music. I look forward to speaking with you all. I hope you enjoy these two clips. It shouldn't be more than 20 minutes, and then we can have a conversation. Thank you for your attention, and I'm so happy to see you tonight.
Okay, so I guess my first question is, how does a project like jazz begin? Is it with interviews? Is it with writing a narration and a structure? Is it the music? Is it the photographs you find?
It's sort of all of those things all at once. I've never found a process that so mirrors what's inherent in jazz than what we've been doing for the last 25 years. I don't think it's a good idea for a documentary to merely be the expression of an already arrived at end. That is to say, all about what I know to begin with. They should be processes of discovery, and in fact, we don't know about these subjects and want to find out. And what we want to make sure is that we're free of the kind of formula that I think results in a more essayistic, expository stance that almost has the filmmaker looking down at the audience rather than talking up at them as we've tried to do. And I think the success of the films is predicated on that relationship. So we begin at the same thing. We start reading, we start asking questions, doing the interviews. Every time you see a talking head in a film, they have no idea the question's coming. We have no idea where in a script it's going to go. In fact, usually most of the interviews are done before we've seen a rough draft of a script, which in and of itself will undergo 20 iterations in the course of editing. We go to archives and film what we're drawn to visually, so we're not have our head buried in a script. And we work on a script unconcerned with whether there are images to quote illustrated. In fact, we avoid the word illustration, finding that a kind of pedantic thing, and look for what Paul Strand would call the equivalencies that were present that would make the combinations of word and picture add up, 1 and 1 add up to 3 and not 2. And so we're just going along. It makes editing hell. We have 1,000 hours of material which we have to distill down and perform awful triage, but it permits us to yield to story when it's appropriate, yield to composition and visual integrity when it's appropriate, yield to historical moment wherever we find that, and yield to discovery in the end.
If you started out, I read that it was 3,000 pieces of music that you initially had, which you finally used about 498 of, more than 15,000 photos, 1,000 hours of footage. I mean, can you just tell us a little about the process of editing that down to 17 and a half hours?
Well, I live in New Hampshire and we make maple syrup up there. And it takes 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. So I guess that's a fairly apt thing. We probably touched over 100,000 photographs. We know we Xeroxed so that we'd have on hand in record books that would go for shelves and shelves and shelves, 20,000 photographs. And we know we shot 6,000 of those. And when I say shot, we don't hold them at arm's length and shoot them. We go inside and tell the stories within that. So there might be 10 shots of one photograph, and we might then send it back and have reshoot it so that the zoom in is 11 seconds and not 10 seconds, or something like that. So it's a huge relationship with those images that are shot, and we ended up using 2,500 of them and 2,000 bits of archival footage from those hundreds of hours that we collected and would constantly look at. And of course, half of this stuff isn't about jazz. For all the pronouncements earlier about all the great themes of race and cities and whatever, this is also a film concerned with what kind of cars people drove, what kind of roads they drove the cars on, what people looked like when they thought they were dressing up in every decade of the 20th century, what Times Square looked like, what kind of food we ate. So it was interested in those little small moments of human life, and so half the images we collected, half the footage we collected, had to be about American life, quite devoid of jazz. We feel like we know Times Square, like we live there.
Now, Gerald Early makes the point in one of the first episodes that jazz and film came about at around the same time. Mm-hmm. And of course, we know that both depend on the fruitful tension between individual expression and the ensemble.
Yes.
In other words, between the soloist and the collaborative nature of that process. And you mentioned earlier that you were a kind of conductor. So it leads me to ask how you see yourself really with all of this material. Are you able to really improvise, for example, when you're making a film of this kind? Do you feel that your job is primarily to synthesize, or is there some kind of personal point of view that you are able to carry through in all of this?
That's a great question. There's not a personal point of view. That is to say, I don't have particular axes to grind or isms to promote within these large films, and indeed the smaller ones. I mean, the smaller ones are like 4 hours, so we consider that a short film. But there's an emotional archaeology at the heart of what I do. And I think that there is a sense of trying to, as you said, understand how my country ticks. And I kind of lift up the hood and tinker around with things. And in the course of it, I mean, if you look at the Civil War, which was 6 years of effort, it basically says two things. It has 2 points of view. One, that we were happy that the United States survived. It was clear that the filmmakers felt that. And 2, that we thought slavery was a bad thing. But other than that, it has 1,000 other feelings and points of view. And I have to really explain emotional archaeology, because I do not mean the baser emotions. I mean, the great enemy of art and, of course, history is sentiment and nostalgia. And so we tend to replace that with something more logical, something more analytical. But we also realize in the chaos that's the universe, for which we need to superimpose religion and science and art to help us understand and get through, that sometimes that analytical thing doesn't actually get there, that we notice we live in a world that's dialectically preoccupied with male and female, with won or lost, with good or bad, and that we forget to select for a kind of mitigating, reconciling wisdom. And I found that quite often that larger intelligence is a higher emotional intelligence that helps me understand the mechanics of my country, the mechanics of my art, and the mechanics of that tension between the individual that you speak about, which is not just in cinema and not just in jazz and in filmmaking, but almost all of American life. And particularly in America are we in that exquisite and sometimes excruciating tension between what we want, what others need.
And yet, when I think about all the aspects of this film that you're involved in, I mean, cinematography, you and Buddy Squires are credited, so I presume you were shooting a lot of the interviews. And even though there's a supervising editor, Paul Barnes, I'm guessing that you played a tremendous role in shaping the material. What's your favorite part of the process?
That's a good question. Buddy shoots all the interviews, and that's how we discovered it. Believe it or not, I thought I would film forever. I was a cinematographer when I started off, and the first film we made on the Brooklyn Bridge 25 years ago, we were interviewing Louis Armstrong. Now, you know what I have on my Louis Mumford. And I suddenly realized that I was having a hard time conducting the interview and looking through the camera. So I turned to Buddy, who was then my assistant, who was loading the camera and doing all this stuff. And I said, Buddy, you look through the camera here. And from then on, he's done all the he shot all the interviews, but we both shoot archives and live shots, and I've done less and less as it gone on. I have 3 moments of sort of sublime parts of what I like to do. The first is to be out at dawn at the Missouri breaks and have exerted a great deal of physical effort to get someplace where the light is coming up and you're taking a great shot and you find a great composition and there's just something great. Or more often than not, looking through the camera at an archive where in very crude fashion with magnets we've put an old photograph, say from the Civil War, up at the Library of Congress in a small corner of the Princeton Photographs Department. And you get in there and you look inside the photograph and it comes alive. I treat it like a feature filmmaker does a wide shot, having the possibility of close-ups, medium shots, cutaways, inserts, tilts and pans and reveals. And I not only, as I'm shooting it and I'm totally involved in it, I'm not just seeing it, I'm listening to it. So, you know, are the cannon firing, are the troops marching, are the leaves in the trees rustling? Is the bat cracking? Is the crowd cheering? Is the glasses in the bar tinkling? That's what I want to hear too. And so I listen to the photographs and I love it. So it's that first sort of act of acquiring the images. But no amount of beautiful images makes up for the most important part of our process, which is that moment in the editing room where at any given moment there are 40 photographs that we might use, 50 photographs, 100 photographs, and how we choose, pare down the story, rearrange, take a talking head from episode 2 and move it up to episode 8, and suddenly it comes together. Decide that a favorite chapter on a favorite jazz musician of mine has to go. And just, it's that moment of epiphany in the editing room where these relatively static, moribund images that are kinesthetically quiet suddenly take on emotional movement. They become moving in yet another way because of some thing that we do, some kind of application. And then the third part is what we're doing right now, the evangelism. I love being in front of people and telling them about why I think that jazz is the Holy Grail. And next year I'll be out telling you that Mark Twain is the Holy Grail.
Well, you've led me to one of my next questions, which is what you're working on now. Mark Twain, I presume, a short film comparatively?
Yeah, it's a short film, 2 hours. It's the same film, you know, the big, you know, the emperor has no clothes sort of thing is that we make the same film over and over again, asking the question, who are we? Mark Twain's about American identity and American creativity and race. And race and all of those questions are at the heart of jazz, of course, and many of the things we've done. They're just, each subject is kind of opportunities to get in at this inexpressible whatever it is that we've been talking about. And jazz is just the excuse we've had for the last 6 years to practice.
I bet, though, that you approach something like jazz as an opportunity to become not only a teacher and an evangelist, but a student. I'm guessing that you approach this of what is going to excite me?
That's
What
right.
am I going to learn that I can then share with everyone?
That's at the heart of it, is this process of discovery. I mean, I would hate to do a film about something I actually know about. It would be so boring. It's all about trying to find out about this. So you spend 6 years, you can actually know about stuff. And I've been on panels of jazz experts, and I'd go, but you're wrong, because on, January 17th, 1937, he did this. And it's very exciting, but then you move on to something else. It's discovery. I learned in the course of this, reading a biography of Emerson, Mind on Fire, that the word enthusiasm has its etymological roots in the idea that God is in us. And I like that, to be enthusiastic. And so that one seeks those things that animate one from within, and that touches a higher part of us, a higher force. And so it's so much better to be a student and to share it.
But I think that's one of the things that makes you such a good educator. I read that both the Civil War and baseball are being shown in schools.
Constantly.
And I'm guessing that jazz may in fact go that route too. At the time that you were making these films, did you sort of want and already prepare for a kind of extended classroom situation?
Yes and no. No, because I'm an artist and I'm making the film for me, for us. We're working together, and we are the toughest critics, and we don't have test marketing things. We bring friends and interested people and experts into the editing room to make sure we're getting it right, to make sure that we can watch them and see that they're paying rapt attention to the screen, but mostly in informal ways. We're just struggling to understand it. But we also know that most everything that appears on television, if indeed in the cinema, is like skywriting. The first Zephyr comes along and it's gone, replaced by the next thing. And so one seeks in almost every human endeavor some kind of permanence, some way to fix things a little bit more than this media culture digests and moves on. And having an interest in where it goes in schools is particularly important to us. And one of the underwriters, General Motors, who've sort of been Medicis to us, haven't interfered at all in the productions, spends a great deal of money after the production getting it out to school. So jazz, for example, has educational materials that's reaching 6 million kids. And that is not why we make it or what we do it for, but after the fact, it becomes a way to continue the conversation. I'm walking down the street here or any city or in the subway, and people come up and start talking as if they're mid-conversation. And I can't think of, there's not a rave review or an award that equals that sort of sense of trust in this notion of conversation that you could have with people over these subjects, in which people come up as if they know me, and that's an amazing thing, and begin mid-sentence to talk about something that's on their mind related to the subject. So today in the subway, I had this amazing conversation about the Civil War and jazz, and as I was leaving, that person got off with another guy who was listening to the jazz soundtrack on his Discman, and we continued to change trains together and continue talking about jazz. And I thought, I am the best job in the country.
Well, it's also remarkable because you deal with and you work in popular culture. And you were just talking about the impermanence of everything that is created. But when I think about the 3 major series you've done, the Civil War series, one of the reasons it works so well is that the invention of photography before the Civil War enabled those images to be fixed and for you to use them. With baseball, newsreels, you have the material that you can then use. With jazz, I was fascinated to learn that the first Victrola was 1901, and therefore jazz could be recorded as of 1915, it turned out. So in a way, your films chronicle an entire history of the process of rendering permanent the moments of American history that would otherwise escape us.
That is very well said. I agree completely. The way in which these forms intersect with each other, so that you have the ability, when we talk about the opening bite by Wynton Marsalis, he says, well, Bach improvised. And he did improvise, but he wasn't going to look at the second viola and say, okay, let's play Ein feisty Bird, right? And there is that sense that art has had its sort of private moments, but in America, in an age of mechanical reproduction, we can actually look at Louis Armstrong playing Stardust or singing Dinah and know that we are there at the moment of creation because we have that film footage or we have that recording. And I like these intersections. I like the fact that you can essentially triangulate with the different perspectives, the different materials that I use to make up a film. If you say the materials are old photographs and newsreels, commentary of scholars, sound effects, and complicated music track. And what could be more complicated than making a film about something that's traditionally background, the amplification of emotion, but something here that had to be foreground, the subject, the star of the film, and still not be a performance film, not relinquish the narrative control and drive. So that, for us, it was the most challenging and therefore the most satisfying of all the projects.
I have one question that's perhaps a bit stupid, but because so many of my students at Columbia, when they're making their films, go crazy with music rights, which are very expensive. You've got more music in the jazz series than I've ever heard in anything. Is it, even for you, now, difficult to get music rights? Was that like a major problem financially or even in terms of estates?
Well, I remember when I was in college and trying to deal with the music rights questions when you have one or two pieces of music. Multiply that headache by 498 and you have an idea of what we've been through part of the last 6 years. The great good news in this story is that we were able to convince 2 of the 4 largest record companies in the world to co-produce. It's really a historic agreement to set aside their competitive natures towards one another and to co-produce the companion music. And that cooperation had a kind of ripple effect back to the film. It helped make everyone within the jazz community, not just those 2 labels, Verve and Sony, but the others, aware of the fact that this might be something that would lift jazz up. And indeed, the soundtrack and the various soundtracks are doing quite well, and that's exciting. People are coming back. Part of the problem with jazz for many people is that the jazzerati have given the impression that you need some sort of advanced degree or esoteric knowledge to understand it. And so there's a sense that, I'll stick with the pop music that I know, and nothing could be further from the truth. Louis Armstrong said there ain't but 2 kinds of music in this world, good music and bad music. And good music, you tap your foot to. So we just made a film that was all about making sure that the visitors to our editing room were not only paying that rapt attention, but their feet were tapping, and that the soundtrack would reflect that too. But it's always tough to get the rights and do it. And it's the huge expense of this film budget.
Now, when you set out to make this and you were going to discover all these things, that was one thing, but now you've finished. What was the most surprising thing that you learned in the making of jazz, and also maybe what was the most inspiring thing for you?
Well, because this is a process of discovery, every day is thousands of them, but fortunately the biggest surprise and the most moving kind of thing are one and the same. When I began this project, my conception of Louis Armstrong was somebody who was a jazz musician who played the trumpet pretty well and had a big smile and a white handkerchief and transformed popular songs like Hello Dolly and It's a Wonderful World, and that was it. And I quickly learned that he was the most important person in American music, I didn't say jazz, in the 20th century. And we had a board of advisors, 24 people, who we could not bring together because the jazz world is so contentious. They disagree on absolutely everything, that the fist fight would have broken out just over the size of and shape of the table that we were going to have the meeting at. So we would convene a few here and a few there, and we do stuff by mail and telephone and whatever. But I went to them and I brought what I thought would be this hugely contentious discovery, and they looked at me as if I'd said the sky was blue. Armstrong is, I've decided, to American music in the 20th century what Einstein is to physics and what the Wright brothers are to travel. And he single-handedly sort of took jazz from an ensemble music to a soloist art, inventing swing, modern time, as modern and as radical as Picasso's painting, as the Wright brothers' invention, as the theory of relativity, as Freud's interpretation of dreams, as Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, as an ultimate expression of modernism. And then he transformed American singing, introducing scatting and changing and influencing every singing style. People who had gone before him changed their style. People who have come after him have done that, have all been influenced by him. And all of the people we talked to, after enumerating how great he was, would always say that he was a gift from God or an angel. And my own anxieties about mortality are now tempered by the thought that if I live a righteous life, I might have a chance to see Louis Armstrong blow Gabriel out of the clouds one of these days. And that's really something to look forward to. And it's true. And I'm sorry for those of you who haven't seen any of the series for my hyperbole, outrageous hyperbole about Armstrong. But we think we prove it over and over again in chapter after chapter within the episodes of this film.
You know, when you mentioned the word anxiety, I suddenly flashed onto what may turn out to be a ridiculous analogy, but when I was at Yale doing American Studies, I was studying with Harold Bloom, whose wonderful book, The Anxiety of Influence, had a profound effect on a lot of literary people anyway in the 70s, in which, to oversimplify, he makes the case that the great writers, the great poets, were always struggling, either consciously or unconsciously, against the influence of their great predecessors, so that you have, like, you know, the romantic poet Shelley fighting the influence of Milton or something. Do you think that in terms of the jazz tradition, Armstrong is like the figure that the other musicians are even consciously struggling to find their own voice, literally, against?
Very much so. And against is a difficult word because it has so many pejorative connotations, but particularly in jazz. You have this kind of restless experimentation in which, I mean, Armstrong really rearranged the molecules, and then Charlie Parker did it again, but it was all within the context of Armstrong. And even today in free jazz and the most out there avant-garde, whether the musicians know it or not, they're really still struggling with that canon that was sort of laid down. And that's why it's so important to gather the threads of where you've been. But I think it's true for all of us as we struggle with that. I have on the door to my office in New Hampshire this wonderful quote I heard that Tyrone Guthrie, the theater director, said, and it sort of animated, sort of been a slogan for me. He said, "We're looking for ideas large enough to be afraid of again." And I sort of like the idea that implied in that is that one would, just in the course of things, bite off more than one could chew and then learn how to chew, which always involves that kind of experimentation, that overthrowing. But the large enough to be afraid of again also suggests that you might be part of a continuity that is also kind of trying to overthrow the last big thing. And this is a treacherous razor's edge because we know the way in which one fails miserably by experimenting just for the sake of experimentation, for improvising or having a kind of conceptual relationship so that anything one does is art. And it's not. We know the degree to which one has to impose discipline even in the most improvised piece, or other, it floats away. It has no basis in that communication that's at the heart of art. But it's an interesting razor's edge to be on. And I think it holds true in filmmaking and certainly in writing and criticism, as well as in all the traditional arts.
I'm going to have to impose some discipline on myself. I have at least, an hour's worth more of questions, but we're going to raise the lights because I bet you have questions too. And I'm going to stop dominating the microphone, allow us to all speak together, and I will repeat questions so that you can hear them in the back. One lady right down here.
Oh my goodness, and the power went out.
Just that today on the news at 5 o'clock, California power outage, a teacher said, well, I was about to show you some of Ken Burns' Civil War, but...
I think it's the most watched history film in the curriculum, and people have... I still get letters as if it was shown last week, not 11 years ago.
Okay, there's someone in the back on the... Yes?
Yes,
Oh, I'm sorry, and then you.
Baseball series, you said that Gerald Early has said that the three most beautifully designed things in our culture are baseball, jazz, and the Constitution. Do you have any thoughts or plans to do a documentary on the Constitution?
No, and I don't want to, because I think that you'd end up with a film with a lot of green felt and white quill pens. Which is, I think, the death of good filmmaking. I made a film on Thomas Jefferson, and I had to resort to green felt tables and white quill pens, enough for one lifetime. But you know what? What is embodied in this document, and I agree with him, it doesn't get any better. It's not really a poetic document like the Declaration of Independence. It's a kind of operating manual. And it's so short and so succinct and so good at what it does that it seeps out between every shot and every frame of what I've done in almost every film. It's certainly in the Civil War. It's certainly in baseball. It's certainly in jazz. So I feel like I'm doing it all the time.
Yes.
I'd like to know something about what your collaborative processes with Jeffrey C. Ward. I just read an article about him in the Times, and it was the first I've ever really seen, and I'm just curious about how you work together.
Could you talk about the collaborative process, how you work with Jeffrey C. Ward?
I've been working with Jeff since 1983. He wrote the film that I made on Huey Long, and it has been the most satisfying collaboration you could possibly imagine. Typically, we'll work together for some time, sort of scoping out how we think the structure of the film might be. It always departs from that. And the sort of the chapters that I envision, and then he'll go back and he'll write a first draft. And then we'll work with a co-producer like Lynn and some consultants to fix what's historically wrong, to add in something that we've neglected, to usually cut some scenes out, to pare it down, and then somewhere along the second or third draft, we'll begin editing. At that point, the script sort of enters my territory, and I end up doing a great deal of writing and rewriting, but on the phone to Jeff. So if you look at, say, the jazz script, there's probably not been a sentence or a paragraph that I haven't touched or rearranged or moved or changed something in, but it's really his initial template, and it's been an amazing collaboration. He's written all but two of the films that I've done since 1983, and he and the other person I worked with, Dayton Duncan, on the Lewis and Clark film, he and Dayton are collaborating right now on the script for the Mark Twain, and it's great. And he has a particularly thick skin. A feature film writer has to undergo all of that rewrites and notes and things like that, and then you get to the filming and you more or less film that. Here, it's in editing that we take draft 2 to draft 20, and these things get turned upside down, and you can call them at the end of the day and say, you know that scene you really love? It's gone. It just had to go. But now I have to take this wonderful 5 pages and make it 1, and this is what I've done. And he'll call you back later on that night. And I've literally had many, many days over the last 17 years where I have been on the phone with him for literally 6 hours at a time, where we're writing. So it's hard. I mean, we flatter ourselves, I suppose, to call it a kind of Ellington Strayhorn, where you don't know who writes one note or whatever, but it's often like that. It's been a great collaboration.
There was a woman in the middle, and then a woman down here, and I'll get to all of you in a second. Yes.
Archaeology. Well, first of all, let me just talk about, I see that history for most people is really a collection of dry dates, facts, and events that seems to have for most people very little meaning to their daily lives. I see also that when history is typically engaged at a mass level, it does so appealing to the lowest common denominators of emotion and simplification and sentimentality. Sentiment is itself not intrinsically bad. It's just a way of talking about feelings. So it is, in the case of something about a war effort, true. The way in which this music, and there are many people in this room who are old enough to remember that, the way in which this music became, in a way, the soundtrack to a great deal of one's existence and the amplifications of their own commitments to things. What you don't want to do is paint the picture. I remember reading reviews of jazz and baseball that people talk about the earlier, simpler times of the 30s and the 40s. And I think, my goodness, the 90s are simple compared to the 30s, which saw the greatest economic dislocation in the history of the planet, and the 40s, which saw the single greatest loss of life in the history of the planet. How can we be living in anything but simpler times compared to those? And so the rest of that episode, for example, enjoins many of the themes that Duke Ellington implied in Jump for Joy, and the kind of monumental hypocrisy of a war about ethnic cleansing, as Gary said, but segregating the United States Army, and in a later scene finding out that black soldiers could not go into restaurants off base that German prisoners of war went in. So you have to engage it. You can't be afraid of emotions that many people feel, but it's how you present them becomes, I think, the critical nub. And to avoid using history to advance some kind of whitewashed, sanitized Madison Avenue, picket fence, mourning in America use of history. That is repulsive to me. I want a true, honest, complicated past that is unafraid of controversy and tragedy, but equally drawn to those stories and moments that suggest an abiding faith in the human spirit, and particularly the unique role this remarkable republic plays in the positive progress of mankind. That's what I believe in.
Ooh. There's a woman here, then a gentleman here, and then I'll move to that side and back to the right. Yes.
I just want to ask you, growing up in our generation, we were always taught history from a typical male perspective of the wars, the armaments, it was a male thing. And in some sense, though I'm a tremendous fan of your work, it's a very male interpretation of history and the greatest things that have happened in history, with the exception of the Civil War, which the loss of the women in those communities in Maine, which I found just so compelling. And could you talk about this? And where are the women in your work?
Well, I think they're
Did
there
you hear
all
the
along.
question, by the way, in the back? Did it? No. Just that this woman, though a great fan of Ken Burns's work, is acknowledging that there is still a male perspective, which is traditional in history altogether, that it's a male vision of military history and everything else, with the exception of the Civil War and the loss that the women had felt. Could you talk about the male perspective that does also inform?
Well, it definitely does, because first of all, history has essentially been written by males, controlled by males for the most part, and I am a male. But having said that, my first film on the history of the Brooklyn Bridge celebrated, I think, unlike any other story of the building of the bridge, the person who was ultimately responsible for its creation, Emily Roebling, who became the chief engineer by default when her husband was incapacitated by the bends. The second film I made on the Shakers is about a millennial sect that holds men and women in absolute equality, a sect founded by a woman, and celebrated throughout that film women. The Civil War series, which occupied the next 6 years, was certainly filled with that. The Statue of Liberty is a statue of a woman. Let's see if I can pull this one out. And my last film before this one, which won a Peabody Award, is called Not for Ourselves Alone, the story of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And very much about the neglected part, relegated to usually a photograph and a caption in history books, or a small dismissive thing of the two women most responsible for changing the lives of a majority of American citizens. I'm always aware of that, but let me just also finally say I am the father of 2 daughters, so, it's all about women to me.
Gentleman here. Two questions. The first is, in your movies, there's often a Horatio Alger aspect. Abraham Lincoln from Rags to Riches, Babe Ruth, similar story, and in jazz, Louis Armstrong. Could you comment on that? And second, what did you think of Clint Eastwood's film Bird?
I like Bird.
Bird, Clint
I like
Eastwood's film.
Clint Eastwood's film Bird pretty much. And I hope that you could, if you've seen it, next, what's it going to be, next Tuesday and Wednesday, the episodes that deal primarily with Charlie Parker, you might be able to compare them and see the differences between the exigencies of a feature dramatic film format and what we've done with the documentary form. I don't consciously seek out the rags to riches. I am interested in the history from the bottom up, but not a bottom implied economically, but a bottom implied in terms of notoriety per se, so that it was as important for us to follow the ordinary soldiers north and south and the effect on the towns in Maine and Tennessee as it was to follow the fortunes of Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, Lee and Grant, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that in an American environment, you're constantly presented with the fact that unlike many other countries, even democracies, in which people are still segregated by class and opportunity, that we find that the American narrative is filled with people who are able to transcend that. I mean, we have a president for the next couple of days who comes from one of the poorest states in the Union and from one of the most poorest and dysfunctional backgrounds. And odds in any other environment of that kind of ascension is virtually nil. And yet it's happened. And I think that we are, on balance, the beneficiaries of a system that promotes a Louis Armstrong.
I said I'd go to this side, the gentleman in red, and then a woman next. Could you comment on the extent to which you think that rock and roll, Elvis Presley, et cetera, the Beatles, contributed to the demise of jazz in this country? Or lack of popularity among the younger generation towards jazz, vis-a-vis jazz?
Well, there's a whole set of culprits that did it. One is the World War II. I mean, when you kill that many people, tastes inevitably change. The world just is different, and the swing bands sort of began to decline after the war. People were more interested in the attractive canaries, the female singers, and the crooners, the male singers that fronted for those bands, and pop music became ascendant. What the musicians played, how they played it became less important. Because Charlie Parker had helped to usher in with Dizzy Gillespie and others the bebop revolution, which was a much more cerebral music. The impulse to get up and dance that had been at the heart of jazz from the beginning sort of left, or most people felt it wasn't there. And so some swing band leaders like Louis Jordan would take the simplest, most crowd-pleasing aspects of swing and invent R&B. And later on, jazz singing fused with the gospel church and created soul, and out of R&B and soul came rock and roll. And so you see a kind of evolution of popular forms. You can even trace hip-hop and rap to jazz forms. All of them became sort of very commercial, folk in their indigenous sense, and pop in their artistic quality that sort of shoved jazz out of the way. But they've always gone back to this wellspring, to the source, to be renewed and refreshed. So it's always been there and always will be, I think, as long as there's a republic. But I wouldn't hold so much rock and roll the culprit as a whole series of events within the art of jazz, not too dissimilar to painting, where abstract expressionism came in, replacing a tendency for centuries to have representational painting. And all of a sudden the mass audience that had at least in some way, shape, or form participated in painting felt that they had to yield an understanding to the cognoscenti, to the experts, in the case of jazz, to the jazzerati, who then would define tastes and find a popular audience further and further away from feeling that they had the inner tools to negotiate each new form.
Yes, the room there.
One of the criticisms that was made of the jazz series was that you emphasized the Louis Armstrong and the early origins of jazz and kind of, ignored a lot of the later people. How was the decision made, whom to include, whom to emphasize, and whom to exclude? I mean, there are too many people after us who we would have been, watching until the year 2002.
At least.
One of the criticisms of jazz has been that you concentrate so heavily on Louis Armstrong and on the early years and much less so on the later years. How was the decision made of what to include and what to exclude?
It's a great question, and I think in some ways, on one level or one way of seeing it, a very legitimate criticism. And you've really asked two questions. Let me address the first one. Our film narrative goes up to 1975. That is to say, our ability to speak and go into depth about the periods. And we feel that we've given equal treatment to the movements. We've certainly acknowledged the, Armstrong and Ellington as the sort of the double helix, the DNA that helps you understand jazz. And indeed, they are still the two most influential people. But you get to know over the course of the series maybe 30 or 40 people pretty well, like major family members in your album. We then unhitch our narrative, and the last 30 or 40 minutes of the film is an impressionistic, but I think good piece of filmmaking that celebrates the diversity of the last 25 years, the diversity of jazz today, and indeed looks to the future of it. And I hope your patience with the series will extend to the last episode. I'm in the business, though, subject-wise, of history. History is about stories that are over. The last 25 years are about stories that are ongoing. They are not finished. They are the province of journalism, of criticism. And so I am loath to intrude on that territory, which is, of course, going to upset a critic who's wondering where all the people they write about are every day, and naturally going to feel, particularly since I'm an outsider, that some interloper has come into their territory. But I really made this decision, we all made this decision, almost from the get-go. We knew exactly where we would stop and more or less how impressionistic and open-ended this last thing would be. We have to do it. We lack historical perspective. And indeed, when I approach some of these critics and try to speak to them openly and frankly, I say, if you can tell me who among today's players are the equal of an Armstrong, an Ellington, a Parker, a Gillespie, a Davis, a Coltrane, a Monk, a Mingus, I'll open up this series and keep working on it. And there's total silence. And inevitably, if they say anything, it's that, we need a couple more decades to know who that would be. So that's one argument for why it is. This is not the end of jazz discussion. This is the beginning. The Civil War has sponsored dozens of documentaries. The baseball series has sponsored dozens of really great documentaries in the 7 years since it's been out. This should be a first word, not a last word. As to exclusion, it was our intention to tell several stories and to tell them well, rather than to try to tell every story and to tell none well and end up with the narrative drive of the Manhattan phone book. That required a certain amount for us of excruciating and difficult triage to decide who to leave out. And every one of us had to leave out favorites of our own in order to try to tell a complicated story. And in a community that is so have circled the wagons. Jazz used to be 70% of the music in this country. Now it's down to single digits. You can imagine the mentality of those charged day to day, as I am not. I'm a visitor. With protecting, defending, describing, criticizing this music, how incredibly awful it is to not have the person that you love in this film. And yet I did not make it for them. I engaged the best talents within the jazz community from every stripe, but I did not in the end make it for them. I made it for everyone else who really needs this music. It is our birthright, and we have moved so far away from it that for those who know a little bit about it, it was a way to reacquaint and reinvite. For those, and it is the overwhelming majority of our fellow citizens who know nothing about jazz and have assumed that they do not care to know anything about jazz, it was incumbent upon me, my goodness, it was incumbent upon me to share the bare bones of the story. But, let me tell you, as a filmmaker, if you've made a 10-part, 17-and-a-half-hour film, and what people are criticizing is what you've left out, it's like, whew.
Gentleman in the back there.
What has your work taught you about race in America that you would want to share with us to help us with our work?
What has your work taught you about race in America that you would like to share with us to help us in our work?
I think, as I was saying in my introductory remarks, that we put Black history into February, which is the coldest and the shortest month, as if it is some addenda to American history. And anybody who studies American history knows that when you scratch the surface, even in the most superficial, rudimentary fashion, that you touch race. And most of us in this room would prefer that it sort of be that way. It's more comfortable to have it be a theme and not an organic difficulty that requires our dealing with, our confronting, as Wynton Marsalis says. We forget that when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, it not only freed 4 million Black American citizens, and most important, their descendants, it freed the rest of us, beginning particularly with the slave owners. And we have to understand that this monumental hypocrisy that this nation is founded upon, or is presented to us in stark contrast to the extraordinary last best hope of Earth that I agree it is also, that Lincoln suggested that we are, I think requires a kind of daily vigilance. And so I do this for me. It liberates me to confront the race question in all its myriad forms. And it's come in many packages. I don't know why it's possessed me. I remember when I was 8 and 9 and 10, staying up all night, fretting over the images I'd seen on TV of fire hoses and dogs in Selma. And those scarred me. But it goes deeper than that. I'm passionately interested in how my country ticks. And I don't think you can actually deal with that in any meaningful way and not touch race, or you can't really leave it for too long. And I think we begin to see the extraordinary contribution of African Americans to the soul of the country, and how much, this art form, the blues, so much of our social, popular, musical lives are governed by an extraordinary combination. And in the end, there's an ultimate absurdity about judging or prejudging human beings based on the color of their skin. And I'd like to at least know that somewhere along the line, my country, which has done a better job than any other country, and don't let anyone tell you, we've engaged the problem more than anyone else, is on the road to having this not be a question, that it's not even a question, that it shouldn't be a question.
I've gotten a signal that I'm supposed to wind this up because there's a book signing.
Oh, my goodness.
Ken Burns is going to be signing copies of the jazz book, and you'll get a chance to actually ask him a few questions. This is terrible because I have like 7 hands and there's no particular order.
This is what we had to do in the jazz series. Just choose
See,
one.
now I'm starting to identify with Ken Burns, but I've been told that the questions are going to have to come in a more personal way because he's going to be signing books over there. So at this point, with great regret, I'm just going to say that if in the film Frank Lloyd Wright, the voiceover narration at one point says about that architect and visionary, he made us see all of history fresh. That's just as true of Ken Burns. So for this part of the evening, I thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.